Hey guys, what's going on? First of all, hope everyone had a Merry Christmas and had some time to just spend with family and relax a little bit. We are back with the weekly quizzes. This week's theme is going to be Rook Endgame. So all the positions are coming out of Rook Endgames. I asked you guys last time if you like the idea of themes, and most people seem to think that that was a good idea. So I will be doing that going forward. Like I said, this week it's going to be Rook endings. Next week is going to be games from Gary Kasparov when he was 12 years old. You're going to see positions from games when he was 12 and try to figure out what move you think he played. So that should be pretty interesting. If you are interested in participating in that, there's a link in the description below. You just have to click that. It'll take you right to the quiz. That's where I get the data that I use for all of these. Having said that, let's jump right into these positions. All right, so here's position number one. It's white to play. You have to figure out the best move for white. If you'd like to pause and figure out what you think white should play, go ahead and do that now, and I'll just give you a few seconds. And if you're ready to see the solution, here we go. So this position, what was actually played in the game by the white player was bishop to g6. And I kind of thought that that would throw some people off, and maybe also even king g2 is kind of an idea because you're going to be attacking this rook, getting your king off the back. But pretty much everyone in all groups said bishop takes c6 check. So we have 0 to 1,000, 89%, and then the other missing 11% were like moves that weren't legal, so I'm not really sure what they wanted to do. And then again, 1,000 to 1,600, pretty much everyone said bishop takes c6 and some moves that didn't make sense. And then 1,600 and above, everyone said this except one person said rook to f8 check. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But yeah, bishop takes c6 was actually the best move, and I don't know how many people actually saw this, but it's more than just taking a pawn with check, which of course there's nothing wrong with taking a pawn with check, but the main idea here is that after king d8 you actually have a forced checkmate. So if you didn't see that and you want to try to find that now, it's actually mate in 3 from here. You can pause again if you want white to play and mate in 3. And for those of you who are ready to see the solution, or maybe you already saw this, it's rook to d7 check, and so black has to make a decision which way do they want to go. If they go this way, well then it's just checkmate immediately because the rooks are cutting off the king. So black has to go here. The problem is that it steps into the discovered check by the rook, and you can actually move this rook a lot of different places. One example would be rook to a7, and the point is you're unleashing the bishop. This rook stops the king from going here, so the king has to go back, and you kind of end up with the same thing where you get the ladder mate. So that was the idea. More than just taking a pawn, there was a checkmate, and I wanted to see if you guys saw that, but pretty much everyone saw that, so it was a pretty easy one. Let's go ahead and go on to position number 2. All right, here's position number 2. If you want to pause and figure out what you should play for black, go ahead and do that. Give you a couple seconds. And if you're ready to see the solution, here we go. All right, so the 0 to 1,000 category, we had most players wanting c4, then we had bishop e5 check, and then bishop to g1. 1,000 to 1,600, again we had c4, and then bishop e5 check as well, and then the third move was d5. And above 1,600, again c4, again bishop e5 check, and then rook to f4 was the third move. All right, so real quickly, let's talk about what's going on here. This is an opposite colored bishop endgame. Now, that means black's bishop is on dark squares, and white's bishop is on the light squares. And so you can see that neither bishop is going to ever be able to oppose the other bishop. And a lot of times when you get into endgames like that, you have a very drawish positions, because what happens is the bishop can sit next to a pawn like this and just kind of blockade all the light squares, and black can't really do anything. And then the same thing, you know, black could kind of just sit and blockade the dark squares, and white couldn't really do anything. Now this happens to be a little bit of a different situation because white has these two separated pass pawns and black has these two connected pass pawns. And having the connected pawns actually gives black some chance to potentially win, because if you can use the pawns to help each other, they can kind of counteract that bishop and actually make some progress. So that's why this position is slightly better for black, even though material wise it's basically the same. It's very easy to blockade one pawn, a little bit more difficult to blockade two pawns. So that's the first kind of thing that you want to be thinking of. And also, you know, if white were to be able to kind of park this bishop somewhere in front of the pawns, maybe get the king defending it, and then use the rook to kind of block the rook from checking, black wouldn't be able to really make progress. But white's king is kind of out of the action and the bishop's not really blockading either, and black's pieces are in a very good location. So having said all that, the best move, which most of you actually got, was c4. And you're starting to push the pawns, but at the same time, you're doing it with tempo. So that's kind of nice. You're getting the attack on the rook. And you're putting it on the same color as the bishop, which a lot of times in endgames, that's what you want to do because it kind of can limit your opponent's bishop's scope. But at the same time, you have to be careful because if you put all your pawns on the same color, then they can become targets. Now, in this case, it's not really a big deal if it becomes a target because we can always just push it forward. It's going to be defended by the bishop. We don't have to worry about that. So that's why c4 is the best move, creates the discovered attack, and starts pushing these guys forward, which really is going to be black's only chance to win the game. Now, one interesting thing about c4 is that it does put the pawn and the bishop in the same rank. And what that allows white to do is play the move rook to a4. So if you said c4, this is a move that you should have considered as well, and you should have had a good response in mind. How are you going to respond if white plays here? The idea is that if you push your pawn, you're going to lose your bishop. And if you play d5, which is kind of a logical move to defend it, well, now white can actually sacrifice the bishop. And when you capture, white's going to take, and you no longer have any pawns. You do have the rook and the bishop, and technically, if you were able to figure out a way to win both of these pawns, you maybe would have some winning chances if white didn't know how to defend the rook and bishop against king and rook. But very difficult endgame, and on top of that, white already has 2 pawns. The likelihood that you're going to be able to capture both pawns and then still win the endgame, very unlikely. Most likely, this is going to be a draw. So this is kind of an important thing to keep in the back of your mind when you get to these pawn endgames. If there are only a couple of pawns left, sometimes sacrificing one of your pieces to like get rid of a few pawns can give you a draw. And so you always want to keep that in the back of your mind as an idea. Like this should have popped in your head as soon as you see the move d5. Like, oh, you know what? I can sack and get both pawns. And then, yeah, that's probably going to be a draw, right? So keep that in mind. But what you could have played instead as black is rook to c5 is one option. And get ready to support the pawn with the rook. So that would have been okay. And also there's this really nice line, c3. And if the rook takes your bishop, you have c2. And the point is that the bishop can no longer stop it now, right? It's on the wrong color. The rook can't go here to stop it. And if the rook tries to go behind, guess what? You have rook to c5, really nice move. And basically, you know, white's going to have some problems here. Rook to g4 check, only move. And eventually you can get your king out of the checks. And let's see, it's showing that white has some sort of, yeah. So now white has to come down here. You get a queen. They have to give up the rook. And much easier to win with the rook and a pawn against, you know, these guys right after this happens. So that's a cool line. That would have been nice if you saw all that. Obviously, you didn't have to see everything. If you would have just saw the idea that after here takes, you know, that you have rook c5, and then eventually you can hide behind the pawn and get out of the checks, that would have been good enough. Now, the interesting thing is you might say, well, white didn't have to do that. White could have done something else. First of all, there's no check on the king because the bishop controls that square. So white could try something like rook a8 to, you know, be able to create opportunities to check. But this is actually even worse for white, and you're going to do the same plan. You're going to just push that pawn. So you're going to play c3. So yes, white can get a check here, but you actually have this cool line, king f6, check. You could even go king e7, and you're getting out of the checks now. You're giving up the rook intentionally with the idea that it doesn't even matter. You're going to play c2 next, and guess what? The rook has no way to stop the pawn, and the bishop obviously can't stop it either. So you're getting a forced queen. There's nothing white can do about it, and black's going to be way ahead and win the game. So, you know, because of that, if we go all the way back here, when you play c4, actually the best move for white is to play rook a4, even though after c3 it doesn't really work. This is the best thing that they could have done. Rook g4 check, king f6, and then rook c4. We get rook c5. They can throw in some checks. And eventually, you know, we get this position where we already talked about, right? So this is actually the best thing that white could have done, even though it's not really ideal, because you still have this pawn that's white's going to have a hard time stopping, and the rook's going to be able to control those pawns nicely. So it should be no problem for black to win from here. So if we go back to this position, bishop e5 check, like some people said, is actually not a good move, because now white can play king f2, and guess what? The king is going to be able to assist in stopping the pawn. And so now you can't just push your pawn forward and expect everything to work out okay. White's king is just going to come over and stop you. So this was kind of a crucial moment in the game where white's king was too far to stop this pawn, right? And so that was kind of what you had to keep in mind. The other move, somebody said bishop g1. I like the idea. You're kind of like almost creating a mating net. The problem is you don't really have a way to follow up on that. Like, yes, you're sort of trapping the king, but you can't really do anything that's going to lead to a checkmate. And you've given white some extra time. They can play something like, check now. You have to deal with this. Rook to d7. They're starting to get behind your pawns. And, white's going to be able to most likely get a draw, at least according to the engine, if they play correctly. So you really just had this one opportunity, c4, and that was what I was trying to see if you guys saw. So if you found c4, congratulations. Let's go on to position number 3. All right, here's position number 3. If you want to pause and figure out what to play as black, go ahead and do that. And if you're ready to see the solution, here we go. All right, so 0 to 1,000, we had top move was rook to d5. Then we had king to g7, and then rook to f3 check. 1,000 to 1,600, top move was king to g7. Then we had rook to d5 check, and then rook to e6. And above 1,600, again, we had king g7, rook d5 check, and rook to e6. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the obvious rook to d5. This was actually what was played in the game by the player. This was like a 1,700 rated player on Lichess. They played rook d5 check, which kind of makes sense. You're just trying to use your rooks to push the king down the board. King f6, they played rook e6 check, right? So you're just kind of doing this. The problem is now, when white takes this pawn, what are you going to do? You got to move this rook. It's being attacked, so you can't just keep going with your little, checkmate idea. That doesn't work. Your rook's under attack. And if you slide it over, let's say here, well, now white captures this, and it's probably going to be a draw. You don't really have a way to make progress. White's rook is involved. You actually have to be careful. Your king is kind of more trapped than white's king is at this point. And so that's why rook d5 check, there was just no good follow-up, right? After this, now white's just threatening to take your pawn, and you don't have anything good. So because of that, let's go and consider this move. Rook to e6. It's a nice idea because it's really cutting off the king. White's king has nowhere to move, and you're planning to go, here, checkmate. So that's cool. The problem is white can very easily stop that. Rook c5, let's say. And what are you going to do now? There's not an easy solution. Like, yeah, you can take the pawn, but then white has, let's see, rook to e5, forcing some trades. And it's still better for black, but it's not as good. So if we go back, king to g7 is extremely important because you're activating your king and you're not losing this pawn. So now you really do have this mating net. Okay, now it's much more dangerous for white. So for example, if white tries to, first of all, this is the threat. You're just threatening rook d5 checkmate. So if white tries to stop that with rook c5 again, well, now you have rook to d6, and you have this checkmate as well, and white can't stop them both. They can't stop this and this. There's just no way. This is coming next move. White can't do anything about it. So only thing white could try is bringing one of these rooks to the d file to stop this rook from moving anywhere along the d file, or white can just take it and force a trade. But black has this really nice move, rook to d6. So again, you're going for the same checkmate on rook f6. So white has to take you. And when you recapture, you now have a new threat, rook to e5 checkmate, because everything is covered here by your king and your pawn, and white is still stuck, right? You might say, well, white can stop the checkmate with the rook. Problem is they can't, because how is that rook going to stop you from going there? Well, here, you're just going to take it, free rook, and here, you're also just going to take it, free rook. So, it doesn't really matter. This way, white survives a little bit longer, but you just take it, and you still have mate. Mate in 3, h4, f6, and again, there's the threat, and it doesn't matter. White can delay with one move, but you just take, and you're still in this mating net. Game ends. So, the point that you really had to see was that without using your king to help with king g7, there was no way to make the mating net work. Just using the rooks, right? Because eventually the king came down, took your pawn, and you just didn't have enough, right? But by using your king, that's when you force white to essentially give up their own rook just to delay the game. But there was no way out of this idea, right? Bringing this rook back and over. So really interesting position. Congratulations to those of you who found king to g7. That was the idea. And like I said, next week we have the theme of Garry Kasparov's games when he was 12 years old. I think that's going to be really interesting. I was having fun looking through those games, preparing for it. So make sure you check that out. Link is in the description below to join that quiz. And you can also just follow along as we go through the video next week. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, take care.